That's going. Let me share my screen and we'll get moving. Okay. So where I'd like to begin and is giving a little bit more in-depth definition to what we mean when we talk about the study of psychology or psychology as it is. Okay. And I think I might have said this on Monday. I can't remember. This first week's a blur for your instructors too. So if this is just repeating stuff, I apologize. But as we know, the term ology or logos means knowledge or study of. Okay. And the term psyche comes from a Greek term that translates as mind, which directly translate as the term breath, literally the word breath. Because what the Greeks believed is that when we're born and we breathe in and we take our first breath, we breathe in our soul or our mind. And then with our last breath, we breathe it out. Okay. Now, this is going to get into one of our first philosophical debates that we get into in psychology, and that's called the mind-body problem. And the idea is the mind and the body one and the same, or is there a separate mind separate from our physical body? Okay. And I will tell you, even with our modern technologies and all of these things we can use in science, this debate can still be debated in either way. So just something to kind of think about. Okay. I'm going to start with kind of what we'll be using as our working definition of what kind of defining what is this mind thing. Okay. Um, our working definition for the class is the scientific study, and I'll stop scientific study of behavior and mental processes, but I want to start with the term scientific and what do we mean when we say scientific in the field of psychology. Okay. It means we use some type of methodology that can be used by other researchers and understood by other researchers to investigate some behavior or mental process. And the idea behind this is that we're measuring something that we think defines something as it is. And I know that's kind of vague, but also so other scientists can try and replicate our findings. Okay. If you've heard in the news or if you've followed psychology over the last several years, we've gone over what's called the replication crisis, where a lot of kind of well-established studies that are used to explain behavior and mental processes that were never replicated, and they replicated them and they didn't replicate. And so that has forced the field to kind of rethink some of the findings that we've had, and I'll show a few here in just a couple minutes. Okay. When we say we say the study of behavior. And what is behavior for psychologists? Behavior is anything that I, as an experimenter, can overtly observe, or I can. So we can say, for example, in this example, it says crying. I can see reaction time. I can see body language. In our modern imaging day, I can see activity in the brain as a person does some tasks. Those are all things that I can observe as a student or a scientist of psychology. When we talk about mental processes, those are all the covert things that as the experimenter or just as a casual observer, we don't have access to. So for example, people's memories, sometimes people's emotional states, because we know we can mask our emotions. How we interpret being a mother or a father, as an example. All of those things I can't directly observe, but in order to understand, I have to ask the person, okay? So I will stop and just say there have been a few people who have suggested that psychology should be known as just the study of the brain. This is very what we call a materialistic view of psychology, but it is becoming more and more common that in studies in psychology, you mention brain and brain processes. For example, in my doctorate dissertation, I was studying social behavior. I was studying loneliness, and I was studying social identity and identity's roles in people's experience of loneliness. So, but in order to get my dissertation through the committees, I had to have at least one chapter that covered the brain processes when a person experiences loneliness or some type of, or when they're thinking about their identity and their relationships to other people. Now, some of the issues with this, because we will be talking about brain processes a lot in this class, is when we get to the biological section, we will see that there's some people who say these image studies are useless. They don't really mean anything. The other issue with imaging studies is they're what called correlational studies. They're not cause and effect. So when someone says your amygdala in your limbic system lights up when you feel anger or fear, is it the amygdala that made you experience that? Or was it your experience that quote unquote, turned on the electrical activity in the amygdala in order to create that reaction within the brain? So this probably is a little bit off for psychology right now, but we will be talking a lot about associated brain areas and given behaviors and whatnot. So the last thing I want to put in as far as our definition of psychology is that we are both a science and a profession. Okay. Now, as a field, we do want to make some positive change in people's lives, whether we're doing something on, memory by memorizing random syllables to see the how the basic memory processes are without previous experience. Okay, that's an example. Or whether we are in a clinic providing therapy to someone who has gone through life difficulties. In the science area, what we're interested in is just the basics of human behavior and mental processes, whether we're talking abnormal, disordered behaviors, positive, happiness, those kinds of things, or just basic psychological processes such as decision making and memory. Okay. In the profession, we apply what we know from the scientific studies in order to change some person's outcome. So I mentioned clinical and counseling psychology, which are probably the most prevalent. My master's degree is in industrial organization psychology, so I use the scientific method and what we know about human behavior in those days. That was a long time ago. In those days, to increase productivity in the workplace or leadership skills or whatever it may be. So in a way, we're both a science and a profession, okay? So with that definition, we have basically four goals of psychology, okay? And these four goals are circular because they're ever changing based on technologies, methodologies, replication, but these are kind of the four goals that we use in order to investigate some psychological process. Okay, and I'll kind of use a clinical one because it's a little bit easier to understand. But let's start with this first one, which is description. Okay, what do we mean when we describe something? Well, let's say we find a population of individuals that off and on, or maybe consistently over time, have a very low affect, um, uh, moodiness or lack of moodiness. They have sleeping issues. Maybe they sleep too much or can't sleep at all. They have eating issues. Either they're eating a lot or they're not eating at all. They're having trouble engaging in work, maybe school and their family. And we wonder what it is about this set of symptoms, as you would say, that is kind of unique to these individuals. And so we'll measure it, we'll observe it, we'll put these behaviors together. And let's say we label this description as depression. Okay. So we find that people with these common symptoms tend to have similar experiences. And because it deals with low mood and low affect, we name the thing depression and we give it a definition. Okay. Once we have what it is that we're looking at, we then want to understand it, meaning being able to state the causes of the behavior. So this is where we look at what are the biological underpinnings. So, when we look at depression, we see levels of low serotonin, dopamine issues. So with neurotransmitters, we see issues like that. We do see some genetic propensities or predispositions. On the psychological end, we recognize that it's a person who has very low self-efficacy and self-esteem normally. They tend to not think of themselves as well or as a good person or worthiness. On the social end, they lack a lot of social connection and social interaction. So now we're starting to understand the kind of causes of the behaviors that we're seeing. We're seeing all of these biological, psychological, and social issues that are going on. So then what we want to do is once we know that, we want to predict it. So for a given individual, based on our definition, our description, and the different behaviors we see kind of predisposed to that, those symptoms, how can we predict it? How can we forecast it accurately? So for example, prediction-wise, the majority of everyone in this class will go through a depressive episode. Okay. But for 90% of us, those depressive episodes will dissipate within 90 days. Okay. So what we want to do is, since we know most or the majority of people will go through that, and we know we can predict that 90% will have those symptoms alleviated within 90 days, what about that other 10%? And this is where we get into defining things like clinical depression or chronic depression. And then we want to go and say, so how can we predict that 10% that will be chronic in that condition? Okay. And then, of course, in the good sense, for example, with depression and counseling and clinical, we want to know how can we control these symptoms? How can we make it so people don't experience those depressive symptoms? So we put in some type of treatment modality where we work on the biological. Maybe we get them with a psychiatrist or a medical provider to give them something to balance out their neurotransmitter system. We get them into seeing a counselor or maybe some group work to work on the psychological and social aspects of their symptoms. And we see if that alleviates the individual symptoms of depression. Okay. Now, I will say that this is the most controversial part of psychology as we get into other fields. You think of things like, I don't want to use the word mind control, but you can think of books on how to manipulate your family or manipulation techniques, all of those kinds of things. So not always is it an altruistic outcome that we have when we're investigating these things. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind. That's kind of the controversial aspect of psychology. But these are our four goals. So let me see. Really quick, you don't need to unmute yourself, but I just want to know, you could put no, yes, I have a question. But in the chat, can you either put a question or put I'm good for right now? Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. Looks like we're all okay. So thank you for responding, everyone. Okay. So just kind of elaborate on some issues. I do want to talk about some common misconceptions about psychology. So we're going to start with probably the three major myths that we deal with in the field. And then I want to go over some examples of findings that we've had that um, uh, that still permeate popular culture, but from a scientific perspective, we have found that they're not valid. So some common misconception is the first myth is psychology is all about mental health. Um, as we will see later on when we get into the different fields of psychology and things you can do as either scientists or practitioners, there's a huge variety and types of psychologists. Um, but behind every myth, there's reasons that that myth exists. So, for example, when we look at the American Psychological Association, about 52% of its members are clinical and counseling psychologists. So the partial part of this myth is that it's such a prevalent part of our field that it's understandable that quite a few people assume that all we think about and work on is the disorders and mental health issues. Okay. The second myth is psychology is not science. And we'll go into how that myth can evolve over time when we talk about pseudopsychologies. But there are a lot of people out there on the internet and on TV who promote psychological ideas that weren't put through the systems of science that we use in psychology. We call these folk psychologies, personal psychologies, popular psychologies. And these are things that people have kind of made up, maybe from a little bit of research, but are just out there. But the study we're dealing with here in academic psychology uses the scientific method to kind of work through behavioral and social issues. Okay. And the last myth that I hope gives some relief if you're ever in my office for office hours or something like that, psychologists, it should say cannot read minds. I need to change that. One of the things, if you're going into social work, counseling, psychology, is that people in your world um, will go, oh, well, he's a psychology student, so he's analyzing us and he's trying to figure out who we are and all those kinds of things. And the thing that I would say is if a psychologist ever says that I can read your mind, go to a different psychologist because we can't. We're actually just as error prone to predicting people's behaviors based on our own personal perceptions as anyone else in the world. And so, no, I can't read your mind, neither can any of my colleagues. However, I will say if you do go into psychology once in a while, especially with people who you kind of annoy you, it is fun to say, oh, yes, I am. That's exactly what I'm doing, because that usually is a good conversation ender. But anyways, no, psychologists cannot read minds. So we make the same amount of errors as everyone else when it comes to predicting behavior. Okay. Okay, so now here's some topics related to this. So these are some of the things that we've studied, and we have found with replication and refinement of um, 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 techniques that we found are not actually accurate. Okay. The first one, for example, is that opposites attract. Okay. The idea that to have a exciting, romantic, loving relationship, you should find that person that has qualities that you don't. So they're kind of your opposite. Okay. But what we have found consistently in the romantic literature, the romantic scientific literature, is that if you want a long-term, highly satisfying relationship, your bet would be better onto finding someone that is like you, not different from you. Okay. Now, there are always exceptions. I always have someone go and say, my dad was water and my mother was fire. There's always exceptions in this. But if you were to take a statistical bet on if you want to be with someone happy and in love for a long period of time, I would put the bet on finding someone like you, not someone different than you. And the reason is the psychological reasons that we're finding that this comes out is when you're dealing with someone you don't know, they're opposite. You have to spend a large amount of time learning how they want you to respond to them. So you're not investing a lot of time into building a relationship. You're investing a lot of time in trial and error, figuring out, well, when they're sad, what do they need? Do they need what I have? Or is it something else? And we spend a lot of time and it becomes highly dissatisfying over time. But when we're with someone that is like us, we know pretty much what it means when they're crying, when they're laughing, when they have a bad day, what to do and how to respond to it. So we're more likely to spend more time investing in building the relationship. Okay. The second one is lie detectors are accurate. The latest research suggests that it's actually about 50-50. 50% of the time it does detect a lie correctly, 50% of the time it doesn't. And so all the machines and stuff they hook up to people, they're only getting about a 50% accuracy rate when it comes to lie detector tests. Hence, they're not admissible to court. Okay. ESP, extrasensory perceptions, has shown to be. I'm going to come back to this one. I'm not sure what I was trying to say here. I'm going to question mark this one. Some of these wordings are weird. Anyways, we'll go on to the fourth one, and I'll come back to that one. People use about 10% of their brain. This is not true. You use 100% of their brain. There's not some deep cavity in your brain that is waiting to be unlocked and for you to become super human or anything like that. Studies have repeatedly shown that we use all of our brain. Where this myth comes from is when we are born, human beings are only born with about 10% of our brain capacity. But through physical growth after we're born to about the age of 6, all the physical areas of the brain are developing and are becoming fully active. Okay. People often repress traumatic childhood memories. Okay, so this one's a little bit more complicated than what it says it is. It was once believed that people could purposely repress memories, that they choose not to remember something. Okay. And we have found that not to be the case. And the most simple example of this, and it's a very simplified example, is if I were to ask you all to imagine a pink elephant. Maybe it's a fluffy pink elephant. Maybe it's Dumbo as a pink elephant. Maybe it's a live pink elephant. And I want you to tell me when you forget that pink elephant. I want you to repress it. Okay, and if I were to have you raise your hand once you say you forgot, then I would ask you, well, what did you forget to remember? What did you repress? Well, that pink elephant you told me about. So the idea is that even when we think we forgot something, we usually have not forgotten it because we're remembering what we forgot. Now, with that being said, your brain can have unconscious processes within the amygdala area and the hippocampal area that when it feels like a traumatic event is not safe for you to remember, the brain does have mechanisms to block that traumatic event or at least serious areas of that traumatic event. Okay. And this is why some people, but then that memory is released when the brain kind of makes a decision that it's safe for you to remember this. I'll bring up the example of when I used to work with individuals who were severely sexually assaulted. And it was very traumatic for them. I used to go see them, do intervention, get them into counseling, all of those things. And then I would mark on my calendars about 9 months to get a hold of them. Okay. And I'd call them in 9 months, and usually they would say, yes, Mr. Peterson, I don't know what's going on. having anxiety attacks. I'm having these nightmares. I smell certain things and I start to freak out, and all of these different things. Okay. Well, in the normal process of things, not always, about 9 months after an assault like that, their life is starting to get some normalcy back, and they've usually gotten space between them and the offender. And so the mechanisms within the amygdala and the hippocampal areas start to allow the person to kind of remember those memories that occurred. This is often why, for example, people who come back with military PTSD really start to have their symptoms when they're back home and they're in a safe environment. But the idea that we can choose to repress memories is not a proven thing. Okay. The next one, students benefit from teachers catering to different learning styles. So if you're a kinesthetic learner, a visual learner, an auditory learner, you should learn in that style, and your teacher should cater to your auditory or visual style. Okay. And there is a whole industry wrapped around this idea. But there now has been published 6 meta-analyses. And what a meta-analysis is when we take all studies that study a similar topic and we squish them together statistically to see if they still have an effect. Okay. And what we found is that catering to your learning style or having a teacher cater to your learning style actually reduces learning. It doesn't increase learning. And indeed, what we find is if you really want to learn something, don't do it in the style you like, do it in the opposite style. So if you're a visual learner and you really want to learn this topic, learn it auditorily. Because when you do that, it forces you to deep process the information and really think about what you're trying to learn. When you're doing it in that quote unquote easy style, you're only shallow processing it. You're not really engaging it and understanding it. Okay. Another myth that came out of psychology is it is best to stick to your initial intuition on multiple choice questions. So here's a good one for the start of the semester when you're going through and doing multiple choice, but then you go back and you question whether you got a question right or wrong. Maybe it should have, you marked C, but now you're thinking it should be A. From a statistical perspective, it's actually more wise to stick with your initial response of C. it used in previous research and old research, it actually suggested you go with your intuition. But again, with better technologies and better measurement tools, we found it's actually better to stick with your initial answer. Okay. And then the last one, people who have psychological disorders are more prone to violence. This is a myth. It's an absolute myth. If I wanted to be safe, I would go be around someone who has depression or schizophrenia. So I want you to think about this person with psychological disorders prone to violence. If you're in the depth of depression, you don't have the motivation to plan out violence or go commit violence. If you're in the depths of an anxiety disorder, you're too concerned about the anxiety that your mind isn't even concentrating on other people. Okay. When we look at even psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, um, people with schizophrenia, and you hear this idea, well, they heard voices to go tell them to commit violence. Okay. But the truth is a person who has schizophrenia don't have deprecating voices about other people saying people are bad, we need to kill them, blah, blah, blah. A schizophrenic is more likely to hear voices about them and how horrible of a person they are. Okay. When we hear in the news that someone said, "Oh, I heard voices," most likely it's because they were high on a narcotic of some type, such as people who snort cocaine tend to have hallucinations of committing violence towards other people. But the idea that people with psychological disorders are more prone to violence is just does not hold out in reality. Now, later in the course, at the end of the course, we'll talk about the difference between mental health and psychological disorders. Do people who are prone to violence, do they have a poor mental health? Absolutely. Do they have a diagnosable disorder? Probably not. Okay. So those are all kind of things that we've been learning as we've been progressing, but tend to be still this idea in popular culture. Okay. All right. So those are some of the myths. These are some examples of topic myths that psychology started, but we need to now say, oh, wait, we were wrong. Now I want to talk about something called pseudopsychology, pseudo meaning false. And I want to make it clear here. When I say the word false, I mean that they don't use the scientific method to investigate behavior and mental processes, and they don't use the scientific method to predict behavior. Okay. And that's what meant by pseudopsychology. The other thing that I want to say is at this moment in time, do we have evidence for these things from a scientific perspective? No, we don't. But as technology progresses, as things progress methodology-wise within the field, someday might we have scientific evidence for these things? Maybe. Possibly. That's why we have to continue and investigate them. Because I know some of you might have a strong belief in some of these things that I'm about to talk to, and I'm telling you, you don't have to stop believing them if they work for you. I'm just saying that there's not the evidence from a scientific perspective for these. So I want to make that disclaimer. But the other reason why I want to bring these topics up is that even though there's no scientific basis, there is some roots in it that makes sense from either a philosophical perspective or some perspective on the nature of human beings. Okay. So the first one I want to go over is something called phrenology. Phrenology back in 1800s, if you wanted to throw a slamming party, you wanted to be the talk of the town, we didn't have DJs back then. We didn't have radio or sound systems or televisions. No, if you really wanted to do a slamming party, you might hire a phrenologist. Okay. Because what phrenologists did is what they believed is that certain convoyances in your skull, by touching your skull and seeing if there's a bump in certain places or an indent in certain places, that those were associated with some personality factor. So if we look at the example here, if there was an indent right here, it meant that you were really prone to jazz. Um, let's see. If you had maybe a bump or an indent here, you were an action-oriented person. Those types of things. Okay. Now, fact or fiction in phrenology, let's talk about where phrenology came from and this idea that you could tell someone's personality by feeling the convoyance of the skull. If anyone has ever been around a newborn or have had a newborn, you'll note that they're born with a soft spot on the top of their head. Okay. And what phrenologists believed is that when the child came out of mom's womb, that the skull was completely soft and it molded to the shape of your brain, okay, and the different areas of your brain. Okay. Now, I will tell you that the reason why there is a soft spot on the top of a baby's head is so that the baby's head could squish through mom's birth canal. So, but the idea that your skull is malleable is a little bit it was kind of an off thing. So, does the shape of your skull predict anything? No, but phrenology was getting at something from a scientific perspective. And that's what's called localization of function within the brain. Okay. That there are certain parts of the brain that primarily respond to or control different aspects of our human experience. So when we get to the biology section, we'll learn that this area right here, known as the occipital lobe, is active during vision. When we get to here, the temporal areas deal with sound. We have two strips right here that deal with sensation and motor movement. And so while they weren't correct on the idea that the skull can tell you something, later this idea is going to be used in science to investigate the localization of function, where certain areas of the brain control certain aspects of our human experience. So anyway, so that's our first example of how we can see something that was completely false. It did have some okay ideas, but then later on actually led to this idea that, okay, there is some scientific basis for at least areas of the brain controlling different aspects of our human experience. Okay. The second one I want to talk about is palmistry, and this is being able to look at the lines and convoyance of your hand to predict different aspects of a person's life. So, there's a line of life. So the health of your heart is determined by this line here. Um, uh, Line of and the like. I can read all these, but anyways, these lines represent something about you and your life, and whether you're a leader or you're an intellectual or an intuition or whatever it may be. Okay. So, from a scientific perspective, is this valid? The answer is no. No one has ever been able to palm read someone and then predict something about them. And in fact, if you know someone who you feel really can do this, there's a university in the Midwest. I can never remember it, but they've had a contest since the 1970s. It started with $10,000, and I believe it's up to a couple $100,000 right now. That if you believe in palmistry or predicting people's behaviors, um, um, astrology or something like this, and you really feel that that person is a clairvoyant, you can go in front of this panel that includes an attorney, just everyday people, psychologists, sociologists, and you can show your skill. And if you predict it correctly, then you win that prize. The reason why it's up to a couple 100,000 is they add money to it each year, and no one has ever been able to actually predict someone's behaviors or outcomes. So, but where is some factual kind of, where is some evidence that maybe the idea that your body can tell you something about your psychological state? Well, palm reading came out from Western culture a couple thousand years ago, a little bit of time with around the Greeks and the Roman, those areas there, where there was a huge revival of this idea that human beings are like nature, that we come from nature. And what do we do when we observe nature? We recognize, for example, the rings on a tree can tell you how long the tree has lived. We can say, you know, how the bark is on, how healthy the bark is determines the health of the tree. We can look at plants and see different veins to see how healthy they are. And so those visual experiences of those do tell us something about the longevity, the health of a tree or a plant or a given thing. And we notice this from the most used parts of those plants. And what are the most used parts in humans? Well, our hands. We use those the most as at least physical entities. So it made sense to them that you could look at the wear and tear in the lines of the hand and the strength of the lines to determine some outcome for a person. So, is there evidence that you can look at a person and determine, you know, something about their health or their psychological condition? And the answer is yes, there are certain ways you can do that. And I'll just give a few examples. For example, the white of the eye, the whiter the eye is, the healthier the individual tends to be. The more yellowed or darker that area becomes, the more sick or more the viral disorders or digestive disorders there can be. Okay. If you want to predict whether someone that you're dating loves you and you want to be certain of that, when you're in the presence of someone who you're totally into, your eye dilates to a 0.7 measurement, okay? Whether it's, dilation of the eye, your eye dilates dependent upon the amount of lights in the room. If you have a lot of light, your eye is not dilated, it shrinks. When it becomes darker and darker, your eye dilates more and more and more, okay? But what we have found in the literature on romance and attraction, or the scientific studies of that, is regardless of the amount of light there is in a room, your eye will dilate to a certain amount and become fixated at that dilated amount. That's why when you see that person in a lighted room, they seem lighter and brighter than usual. When it becomes darker out, you can still visualize them as they move away because your eye is remaining dilated to that amount. So there's some ideas about, you know, how the body can kind of give us signals of through physical appearances, as you would say, about the psychological, or in this case, the romantical intentions of another person. And there's lots of examples that we'll go throughout the semester about different dilations of the eyes, you know, lip movement, all those kinds of things, body mannerisms as we go through. But as far as scientific evidence for palm reading, it's really lacking, okay? And then the last one that I'll mention is astrology. Astrology is this idea that your life can be predicted or is predictive of the star system that is in the sky when you're born. Okay. Now, I'm going to debunk this one right away because the easiest way to debunk this one from a scientific perspective is keep in mind that these astrological signs, the ones we have here on the display, were developed over 2,000 years ago. And in the last 2,000 years, the constellations in the sky have shifted by 6 months. So technically, I was born in later July, so that makes me a Leo, according to the astrological maps. But in all actuality, I need to look 6 months ahead. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The constellation that was in the sky when I was born was actually Aquarius. But we still use these old maps and whatnot. So if you do look at these, just note if you want to know your true sign, you need to shift it about 6 months to have your true astrological sign. But going back to the scientific evidence of time and place when you were born, does it determine some type of outcome for you? And there is some evidence, historical evidence and sports evidence that suggests, yeah, time does have something to do with our life outcomes. Some of the examples is we're going to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day this coming Monday, but I would kind of press you with all of the media out today, social media, blogs, news outlets, all of these different sources of information. Would have Dr. Martin Luther King had the same impact today as he did back in the 60s? And the answer would probably be probably not. But he came and was born in the right place at the right time. Okay. Bill Gates is another good example. A lot of people, he is a very respectful person. I like the guy, but does he have something special that made him more successful than other people? And he did. He was born in the right family at the right place and the right time. Okay. And let me give you an example of the advantages Gates had and probably why he was able to develop the technologies he did at the time he did with his fellow developers. Is at the time Gates was going through school, it was a time when in order to use a computer, you had either a little card or you paid for an amount of time. Okay. And once your card was expired, you could no longer, you had to wait for a week or two to get a new card in order to use a computer. Okay. Well, Bill Gates' parents were pretty well off. I believe they were attorneys, I think. Don't quote me on that, but they were pretty well off. And the school that Bill was going to needed a new computer center for their students. And the Gates family said, okay, we will provide you with the money to buy the computers with one caveat. You can't limit our son's time on the computer. Okay. And what that meant is that by the time Bill Gates graduated from high school, he had clocked more computer hours than most people graduating with PhDs in computer science at the time. Okay. Hence, he had that opportunity based on time and place to be able to develop what would eventually become Microsoft and Microsoft Windows. Okay. So those are some historical examples of time and place and purpose. Okay. What about everyday people? Let's say hockey players. The majority of professional hockey players were born in the month of late December and early January. Okay. And it's tempting to think, well, it's because they were born in the cold months, that it was something about being born in the frigidness of that time and whatnot that created their abilities. Well, in reality, it's because if you're born especially where we get a lot of our pro hockey players, the cutoff to get into junior hockey and whatnot is in December and January. That means that the people who get in December and January have up to 6 months to 12 months more experience than any of their other cohorts. So there's a practice effect, and hence a lot of the more pro hockey players tended to be born in those months. Okay. So again, going back, is there some evidence that suggests your time and place has had an impact on who you are becoming or what you have the ability to do? There is some, at least narrative stories about whether that is true or not. But it doesn't have to do with the stars in the skies. There's just not the scientific, again, I'm going to use that word scientific evidence that that's true. And again, before I move on with this, I know a lot of lovely and wonderful people who use astrology. It makes their life better. It makes them feel good. I'm not saying stop using them. I'm just saying this is the state of our scientific knowledge. Okay. So those are some examples, and I hope you understand that even with all of these, there are some inklings of scientific evidence that the ideas are there, but maybe just not written in the way that they're stated now, or maybe we just don't have the technologies to measure them yet. Okay. So I hope I've done a good job of differentiating between kind of what we look at as scientific and through science, some of the pseudopsychologies, some of the bad knowledge that we put out there that we've had to redact, and some of the myths. So I do want to start on these classical problems before we end and leave with a cliffhanger. But I just want to check in with everybody. Please put in the chat if you're okay with what we've talked about so far, or if you have any questions or comments, just put okay if you're good. If not, we'll get through maybe these first two philosophical debates. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Cool. All right. All right. I'm going to close my chat. So psychology grew out of philosophy, but the difference is that what psychology wanted to do with a lot of philosophical problems is use this thing we call science to investigate them. And so there's some classical problems dealing with the mind and experience and the nature of human beings that psychology has attempted to look at from a scientific perspective. Okay. And probably one of the most basic philosophical things that we still struggle with today, and I will tell you none of these have been answered, is the nature versus nurture problem. And I'm going to use two Western examples in these to kind of tease them out. And I do want to warn everybody, I'm giving a very simplistic version of these stories. If they interest you, I'd actually encourage you to go read the full narratives of Plato and Aristotle, because I'm giving a very oversimplified version of these arguments. Okay. But we're going to start in classical Greece with Plato and Aristotle. Okay. Plato and Aristotle went to the same schools that Socrates was in charge of. Socrates being that famous philosopher with a Socratic method about how to come to the ultimate conclusion through questioning to lead to an ultimate answer. But when Socrates passed away, Plato and Aristotle thought for sure that they were going to leave the school to one of them. Okay. But what Socrates did is he left the school to Plato, and Aristotle didn't get it. And so at that point, there was a schism. Aristotle would leave, he would travel for a while, and then start his own school, while Plato would continue with the Socratic methods, and he wrote a lot about Socrates and all those kinds of things. But in the most simplest version, Plato argued for what is known as nature. Nature determines our personality, our intelligence level, our emotions, how we behave, and nature being those things that we inherited from our parents or through our bloodline. And he believed we are who we are based on who we're born to. And he did this through observing that if you were born a farmer, you became a farmer in these days. If you were born a merchant, you became a merchant. If you were born royalty, you became royalty. And so he argued that based on this, that it is our bloodline, in today's terms, our genetics, that determine who we are. Okay. Now, Aristotle was more of a naturist. If we look at it from the Western perspective, he was the first to formally classify plants and animals into their different areas. So he differentiated, for example, the difference between a domesticated dog, a wolf, a coyote, different types of plants. What's the difference between a flower and a fauna? All of those kinds of things. And he kind of formally started doing that kind of work. He was very much a naturalist and did a lot of observation of nature. And Aristotle, based on this, is going to come up with a totally different answer to this question. Is what he's going to say is he's going to look, for example, at a plant. If a plant isn't planted in the correct soil, with the right amount of water and the right amount of sunlight, the plant fails to thrive. Okay. And therefore, he's going to argue humans are the same way. If a human is not nurtured in the right way, given a good education, given warm, healthy homes, that they fail to thrive. And so he's going to say experience is what determines who we are and what we become. Okay. And so now let's fast forward, now that we understand the classical problem, to modern psychology and genetics and all of those things. Does genetics determine the majority of our behavior, or is it experience that determines our behavior? And the one way we look at this in psychology is what's known as the genetic quotient. Okay. Using different study methods such as twin studies and stuff like this, we come up with this idea of a percentage of something is due to genetics versus experience. Okay. And I will say again, even with our modern genetics, knowledge of the genetic model, genomes, all of those things, this is still very much up for debate. Okay, and we'll later in the class we'll talk about the study of personality. What makes you uniquely you compared to the person sitting next to you? Okay, and dependent upon the study you read, the genetic quotient goes anywhere from 20% up to 60%. So the only thing we really know right now is that somewhere between 20 to 60% of your personality is probably due to nature or genetics. And the remaining amount is due to experience. But it really depends on the study you read. Okay. So that's kind of where we are in the nature versus nurture argument. Okay. And the last one I'm going to cover really quick is the mind-body problem. This is the argument is, do we have a separate mind from our body? Are they two separate entities? We're going to look at two people really quick, Descartes and Locke, who were kind of Enlightenment era philosophers. Descartes was commissioned by the church to really nail down this problem from a scientific perspective, whether we have a mind and a soul that is separate from our body. Locke idea is going to come from his treatise on human beings and government. Okay. Descartes, his main argument, he's going to come from when he was walking through some German gardens. And in these German gardens, there were statues that were hooked up to a hydraulic system that when you push down on a certain stone, the statue would start to move due to the hydraulics in the system by simply pressing down on a certain rock or a certain brick or of some type. And this is where he's going to make the argument. And again, it's much more complex than this. This is where he's going to make the argument that in order for a physical entity such as our body to have motion, to have life, it has to have something external of it acting upon it. And this external thing is the mind. And he's going to put the mind in the pituitary gland, which is kind of funny. We'll understand that when we get to the biology section, but he kind of came up with this idea of what's called dualism, that the mind and body by necessity are two separate entities. Locke, on the other hand, is going to come up with, in his treatise on government and life. Well, I'll just give this as the example. If Thomas Jefferson submitted the Declaration of Independence to my class and I ran it through a plagiarizer detector, I'd have to fell him for that paper because the majority of the Declaration of Independence was actually written by John Locke when he said, all men at that time, all men are created equally, therefore endowed with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But he had to come up with some way that everyone can be born equals. And the way to do that is to eliminate anything that pre-exists one's physical existence, such as the mind. So what he's going to argue is that the mind and the body are one and the same. We are all born with blank slates for which experience writes upon. If we were to put this in modern time, we are all born with blank hard drives that then experience writes our software, writes our programming, and writes our memory. Okay. And therefore, there cannot be a separation of mind and body if we're all truly born equal. And I'll conclude with this. Modern times, is there evidence for either one of these? So on the monolithic end, on the Lockean end, we do know that, if you take out a part of a person's brain, they can lose functioning, some type of psychological or behavioral functioning somewhere in their body. And we can see that the brain plays a very large role in our mental and psychological states. Okay. On the counter argument to that is that we don't really know if the person experiences that loss of function or if they just can't produce it anymore. And this comes from studies dealing with people who are brain dead or claim to be brain dead, but then when they recover, they actually do retain some memories or experiences when they were technically brain dead. The other area that it comes from the study of consciousness. Consciousness being our ability to reflect on our past, current, and future, our ability to use memory and understand what's happening around us and have some kind of conceptualization. And while we recognize that the brain is kind of probably the CPU, it generates the electrical connections to generate our experiences, we still don't know how those electrical connections actually give way to our experience of the world. So to put it kind of this way, I mentioned the brain is probably the CPU, but we haven't located how that CPU relates to our video screen. Why can we see what we see based just on electrical activity? Or our speakers. We have not located our speakers and how electrical activity in the area that produces sound produces our experience of sound. So there's still a lot of debate on the mind-body issue based on some of these, well, let's talk about this or talk about different experiences, but we'll get in later on. I only have 1 minute left, so I